Please remain standing. We're in Matthew 2, 13 to 18. It's on page 912 of your ESV Pew Bible. Matthew 2, 13 to 18, page 912. God's word is sufficient and authoritative. Let's look at it together. Starting in verse 13. Now, when they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream, and said, Rise, take the child and his mother, and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him. And he rose and took the child and his mother by night, and departed to Egypt, and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, Out of Egypt I called my son. Then Herod, when he saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, became furious, and he sent and killed all the male children in Bethlehem and in all that region who were 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had ascertained from the wise men. Then was fulfilled what was spoken by the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping and loud lamentation. Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be comforted, because they are no more. The grass withers and the flowers fade, but the word of the Lord endures forever. Please be seated. Do you remember the classic Christmas cartoon, Frosty the Snowman? I love that movie. It's one of my favorites. We watch it every year around Christmas time, along with other, classic Christmas cartoons. But recall with me the storyline for a moment of Frosty. A magician's hat lands on Frosty's head, and he comes to life. He heads down the street in a parade before realizing that the temperature is going up and that, he might melt. And so he and a little girl named Karen take a train ride up to the North Pole. But the magician, Professor Hinkle, wants his hat back. So he chases after them, and he eventually corners Frosty into a greenhouse. The greenhouse is too warm, and he melts. All seems lost. Now, if the movie stopped right there, that would be a pretty terrible ending to a children's Christmas cartoon movie, wouldn't it? I mean, for good to lose, for evil to triumph, people would not have liked that show, and it wouldn't have the endurance that it has to today. Thankfully, Frosty does come back to life, and Professor Hinkle has to write, I am very sorry for what I did to Frosty 100 zillion times. It's nice to have neat little bow ties to the end of stressful situations, isn't it? If only life could be like that. Most days, though, it feels like we're living life in the moment between Frosty melting and coming back to life. As we look at the state of this world, as we look at the state of politics, as we look at the state of economics and society and law, it can feel like evil is always on the verge of winning, as if we're fighting an uphill battle all the time with no hope of reprieve. And if we find ourselves feeling that way, we are most likely asking the question, can evil triumph over God? Now, reading the Bible, we want to say no. We want to affirm that God is in control. But sometimes what we live and what we know seems to be disjointed. And so let's look at this passage today and let's answer the question, can evil triumph over God's plans? Let's look back at verse 13. It says, Now when they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, Rise, take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt and remain there until I tell you. For Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him. Now remember last week the context into which these verses come. The wise men came looking for Jesus. Herod was upset, but secretly sent them out so that they could report back to him where Jesus was living. And then the wise men were overjoyed when they found Jesus, and they worshiped him and gave him gifts. But they were warned in a dream not to return to Herod. And so they left for their country another way. So this verse that we see here in verse 13 comes immediately after their departure. An angel of the Lord appears to Joseph to warn him about what is coming. Now this is the second time that God has appeared to Joseph in a dream. And we find out that Herod would soon search for Jesus to kill him. Remember that Herod was not a good man. He would kill anyone who threatened to take his power from him. He even did this to his own wife and to one of his own sons. And so he had no problem doing this to anyone else. The angel warns Joseph to go to Egypt. Now, Egypt was a land that had long been known for being a land of oppression for the Jewish people. And this was the place that God had rescued them from back in their history. Now it's going to be a haven, a place where they could escape from danger. Now, why would God call them to go to this land? Well, skip over verse 14 for a moment and look at verse 15. It says, they remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet. Out of Egypt I called my son. See, Egypt was a safe place to stay until Herod died, and this is what eventually happened. Herod eventually passed away. But then Matthew clues us in as to why it had to happen this way. This was fulfilling a prophecy that was specifically given in Hosea 11. Hosea 11, verse 1, says this, when Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. See, God is being faithful to fulfill his promises. Now, Jesus fulfills this prophecy in two separate ways. The first one has to do with the Exodus out of Egypt. See, in Exodus, God used 10 plagues to deliver Israel from Egypt. And that final plague was the death of the firstborn son. See, during that plague, God delivered the Israelites. And it eventually became the first Passover. And this deliverance climaxed with God fully saving all of Israel and bringing them out of Egypt right afterwards. So Jesus is going to inaugurate here a new Exodus, one that is from the clutches of sin. See, in the Exodus, God delivered his people from Egypt. Now, God brings the ultimate deliverer from Egypt. Moses was called to go to Egypt to rescue Israel from physical bondage. Jesus was called out of Egypt and would soon save people from spiritual bondage. So, more than just fulfilling a prophecy, God is showing that new things are about to happen on the horizon through Christ. The second way, though, that Jesus fulfills this prophecy comes from Hosea and the passage itself that it's found in. See, the stress of that passage in Hosea was God's faithfulness to Israel despite their continual sin. Hosea talks about God's love and his kindness and his care for his people, even though they were constantly disobedient. God says he will punish them for their sins, but he will not ultimately destroy them. Even though they deserve it, he won't do it because he loves them. See, we get this picture of God's heart recoiling within him because of the judgment, and instead having compassion for his people. And Hosea 11 ends by talking about how God would restore his people one day. That accomplishment of that restoration is happening here through Jesus. But still, all is not peaches and roses in Matthew. Look at verse 16. It says, then Herod, when he saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, became furious, and he sent and killed all the male children in Bethlehem and in all that region who were 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had ascertained from the wise men. Now, first, this verse suggests a timetable for us. When the wise men arrived in Bethlehem, the family of Mary and Joseph and Jesus were no longer at the stable that the shepherds had found them in. No, they were in a house. And Herod also calculates that this child was somewhere between 0 and 2 years old based on what he heard from the wise men arriving with their gifts. So Jesus has grown some time. Some time has passed, I should say, between the wise men arriving at the stable and the wise men coming with their gifts. Now, Herod must have thought that he was very clever when he asked the wise men to come back so that he could go and worship Jesus. Now, of course, if he was truly clever, he just would have went with the wise men, or even sent spies along with them. But he had no intention of worshiping Jesus. So when he discovered that he had been tricked, he became furious and decided to eliminate Jesus by killing all of the young male children of the town. Now the words "became furious" come from two different Greek words. The first one means enraged, very angry, full of angry passion. And the second word means intensely, exceedingly, and greatly. So this is a picture of someone who is flying into a blind rage, almost as if he picked up a sword and was going to run out and do all of this himself. You see, he thought he was tricked by the wise men, but he became the tricked one. See, he wasn't tricked by the wise men, he was tricked by God. And so his fury is misplaced. But its consequences were very real. You know, it's estimated that the population of Bethlehem at the time was about 1,000 people. It was about the size of George. So there was likely somewhere between 20 and 30 families that lost a son that day. And it's a tragedy, I think, that would have shaken the whole town. It would have shaken the whole surrounding area to its core. I mean, imagine, how would we feel if all of a sudden soldiers showed up and did the same thing here? Herod was ruthless. He would kill all just to kill one. And the Greek here shows that his actions occurred immediately after the flight of Joseph and the family. They narrowly escaped. And this horrible atrocity is followed by verse 17. It says, "Then was fulfilled what was spoken by the prophet Jeremiah." Now, before we look at this actual prophecy and what it means, we should first understand that this is the fourth time that Matthew has quoted a prophecy in this gospel. This shows that what's happening here, it's not a surprise. God always knew it was going to happen. Herod's actions are fulfilling prophecy. Evil people do evil things. But God can use even that, what they mean for evil, for his good. He didn't abandon his people during this dark hour. He didn't leave them alone in it. He was right there, even in the midst of it. God is faithful. It's our first point for today. God is faithful. When we find ourselves facing an overwhelming situation, much like Joseph here, or any other situation, we need to first take time to remember that God is faithful. He has seen his people through the valleys of the shadow of death throughout time. Beginning all the way back with Adam and continuing all the way through today, God has proved his faithfulness. He has proved that he is trustworthy. He has proved that he has the power to accomplish all that he will accomplish, even to the point of humbling himself to becoming a man and dying on the cross. See, evil would love to trick us into thinking that it will triumph. It must have felt like that for the residents of Bethlehem on that horrible night so long ago. But we need to resist that by remembering that God is faithful and that he works for his people at all times. And what does God do for his people? Well, look at verses 14 and 15 again. They say, "And he rose and took the child and his mother by night and departed to Egypt and remained there until the death of Herod." See, in the middle of the night, Joseph took his wife and his son, and they traveled about 75 to 100 miles to Egypt. We think we have rough Christmas travel plans sometimes. Now, every time this word "departed" is used in the Gospel of Matthew, it is used in relation to getting away from danger. Later on in Matthew, when Jesus hears that John is imprisoned, Jesus departs for Galilee. And when the Pharisees want to kill Jesus for curing the man with crippled hands, he departs from that district. Here, Joseph, Mary, and Jesus are departing. They are escaping danger. And Joseph is responding to the angel with immediate obedience. Again, you know, he doesn't voice any objections. He doesn't ask any questions. He obeys right away. He must have understood the danger that they were in. And again, this is the second time in a row that he does this, that he just has complete obedience immediately. So under the cover of darkness, they depart for Egypt, and they're able to stay there until the death of Herod. So in the midst of danger, God is with this family and he restores them to safety. God restores his people. That's our second point for today. God restores his people. See, God never promises to keep us from the valley of the shadow of death that we will go through. When he appeared to Joseph and Mary leading up to this point, and even during this point, he never promised that they would be wealthy and healthy and happy all the time. He doesn't do that for us either. What he does promise is that he will be there with us, that he will walk with us through it, that he will sustain us, and that he will ultimately restore us. Now, granted, we may want restoration to happen on our timetable, but when we remember that God is faithful, then we can pray for perseverance and endurance as we wait to be restored. See, God shows up here for Joseph, Mary, and Jesus. He'll do the same for us. But now I think we all naturally wonder, what about those people who don't receive restoration? Let's look at verses 16 to 18 again. It says this: Then Herod, when he saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, became furious, and he sent and killed all the male children in Bethlehem and in all that region who were 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had ascertained from the wise men. Then was fulfilled what was spoken by the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping and loud lamentation. Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be comforted because they were no more. Now, we've already studied what is happening in verses 16 and 17 and what they mean. But still, I don't want to skip over the horror. Herod, in a fit of anger, kills indiscriminately. He kills all the male children that are 2 years old and under. Families are devastated. Parents who were just watching the first steps of their son and hearing his first words now have shattered hearts and are distraught. Brothers, sisters, grandparents, friends, community members, all are in shock. The prophecy that Matthew quotes puts their thoughts and feelings into words. Listen to it again. A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping in loud lamentation. Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be comforted because they are no more. I mean, how could a parent be comforted in a tragedy like this? It's going to be a long time before comfort is possible. That's why they refuse comfort. There's weeping and loud wailing going on. You know, we're so far removed from this situation that it's easy to be detached from it. But if we were there, we would have hated Herod for what he did, and our hearts would break for these parents. If we lived through it, we would have felt like evil had triumphed. Let's look at the prophecy side of this quote. Matthew quoted from Jeremiah 31, verse 15. Jeremiah in that passage is talking about the time that the people of God were taken into exile. The Babylonians came and attacked Jerusalem. They killed indiscriminately. They destroyed the city. And then they took all the people to Ramah, a place just north of Jerusalem. There, the people were put into caravans and were scattered apart from one another. Families were broken up. This was a time of unimaginable hurt and sorrow. But do you know what's happened, what is said right after this verse in Jeremiah 31? The rest of the chapter, it talks about how God has not forgotten them, how there is still hope for their future, how God's heart yearns for his people. See, by quoting Jeremiah, Matthew is saying that even in the midst of this bitter tragedy in Bethlehem, that yes, the pain is real, and yet there is still hope. The hope is still there. Jesus has come. Children are dying. Mothers are mourning and weeping. And there is still hope in the midst of hurt. Hope doesn't take away the pain, but it exists along with it. See, there's life in the midst of death. The message of hope from Jeremiah is that God will continue to be a God to his people, even in the midst of suffering. He says that his love is an everlasting love, and that he will build them up again. Verse after verse in Jeremiah speaks of Israel's future glory and joy. But here's the thing. The exile that started all the way back from Babylon in 587, years before Christ, it finally ended with the coming of Christ. See, the last true king from the line of David was killed at the start of that exile. There hadn't been a true king over Israel from that moment on. But now, here comes the true king, the Messiah, the Son of God. He has arrived. And so the tears that had begun 580 some years ago were finally coming to an end. The exile is over. Jesus has come. And he will bring a new covenant of grace and mercy and healing. God gives hope. That's our third point for today. God gives hope. And I don't want this to minimize the pain and the grief of this passage, or that may be present in our own lives. You know, I began this point asking what God does for the people who don't receive restoration, and the answer that this passage offers is that God gives hope. But I didn't say, nor could I say, that God will make everything okay after a few weeks of pain in our lives. You know, the pain that these parents had in this passage will last a lifetime. For people who experience this kind of pain, and there are many forms of it in our lives, restoration may not come in this lifetime. Sometimes we have to wait until the other side of glory to experience the restoration that God gives. In fact, there are many people today, or even in the past, who have been martyred for their faith and experience restoration only in heaven. And it's not a lesser restoration. In fact, it's restoration in heaven is more complete than anything that will happen here on earth. It'll be more complete than anything we can experience here on earth. But still, we may not experience it now. And when we don't, we have to fall back on the faithfulness of God, on the truthfulness of God, on the love that He has for us that will sustain us through the difficult times. Evil may seem to triumph for a moment, but ultimately, evil will be defeated. God gives hope. And this hope is only real in our life when we've committed our lives to Christ. See, apart from God, we have no hope. We have no one to walk with us through the dark nights of our soul. We have no one who is 100% faithful. We have no promise of restoration. We have only sin and death. But God would not let it stay that way. He would not abandon us to evil. He sent Jesus to die, and in so doing, He knows exactly how these parents felt in this passage, or any of us who have lost a child. And 3 days later, Jesus rose again, so that we could one day never have to worry about evil again. You know, anyone who's ever asked, why doesn't God do something about the evil in the world? He did. He died to defeat it. And He rose again to empower us to join with Him in His mission to seek and save the lost. The ball is no longer in God's court. It's in ours. Will we respond? Will we commit our lives to Christ? Will we join Him in His mission? So, can evil triumph over God's plans? No. Man may intend to do evil, but no matter what man does, God can use it for good. Leads to our big idea for today. What man intends for evil, God uses for good. What man intends for evil, God uses for good. You know, this is what Joseph, one of the original 12 sons of Israel, said to his brothers. They sold him into slavery out of jealousy. He was accused of adultery and thrown into prison. But God was faithful. He restored Joseph. Joseph never lost hope. And so when he faced his brothers again, he forgave them and told them that what they had intended for evil, God used for good. God triumphs over evil. So to apply this passage to our lives, first, pray that God would grow greater trust in Him. See, living through the storms of life can cause us to question why things are going on and may even bring us to doubt God. But we can get through it when we trust in God, when we can trust in God to bring us through it. He will walk with us through the deep valleys. Trust in him. Next, pray for perseverance and endurance. See, even before we feel like giving up, and especially when we feel like giving up, pray that God would strengthen you to endure. We are weak. He is strong. Lean on him. He will strengthen you to get through it. You know, the wounds may be deep, and the scars may last for a lifetime. But God will walk with you through it all. He will never leave you. He will never abandon you. And finally, find ways to witness in the situation that you are in right now. Even in the midst of difficult trials, our faith can be on display for others. See, there is power in showing that even though we may not know what's going on or how it will end, we still trust in God. You could be the person to strengthen someone else in a similar situation right now. That being said, I also don't want you to feel the pressure to have to do that in the midst of a difficult situation. You know, sometimes we can only concentrate on existing in hard times, much less getting through it, and much less helping others in the midst of it. You know best where you're at and what you can do. Don't take on too much right away. You'll know when you can take on more. But let's remember, what man intends for evil, God uses for good. Trust in the faithfulness of our God. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, Lord, I thank you for the witness of your word. Even, Lord, difficult passages like this. Lord, you know that I like to just see the beauty of Christmas and even the winter wonderland we have out here, and how the nativity scene, it tends to be just clean and joyful. But Lord, there is still immense hurt surrounding these events and a lot of pain. So Lord, I thank you that you kept that for us to learn from, and that you've put it in your word that we can not only understand more about you, but how we can live our lives around it. So Lord, I just pray that you just grow in us trust in your faithfulness, a trust in you, that you'd grow our perseverance and endurance. And Lord, just be with us and help us to go out from here to be a witness for you. Pray all these things in your name. Amen.